Have you ever wondered what happens inside a school when the sun goes down, when the last bell has rung and every hallway falls silent? Imagine walking alone through endless corridors where every creak sounds like a whisper, where lockers slam shut with no one around, and where the shadows seem to move even when you're standing perfectly still. This isn't just your imagination. For some, the night shift inside these schools becomes a nightmare that never ends. Picture a janitor descending into a basement that smells like damp cement, only to hear footsteps dragging slowly behind him. Another custodian steps into a locked classroom, only to hear heavy breathing in the darkness. And in the dead silence of a massive auditorium, someone hears their own name whispered from the shadows, even though they're supposed to be alone. These are not stories written for horror films. These are disturbing true accounts from people who worked in places that turned into prisons of fear once the lights went out. Welcome to The Price Paid, where real horror takes form. Subscribe now if you dare, because what you are about to hear will stay with you long after the video ends. I once worked as a custodian in a middle school, spending nearly 5 years of my life locked into the rhythm of the night shift. I clocked in at 10 each evening, long after the classrooms had emptied, and I stayed until just before sunrise, when the yellow buses started lining up outside. At first, it seemed like the perfect job for me. I didn't have to deal with loud students running down the hallways or teachers leaving endless complaints. The building was quiet, the silence comforting, and I enjoyed being left alone with my work. But the longer I worked there, the more I realized the school wasn't the same place at night. It wasn't just quiet. It was different, unsettling, almost like the life had been drained out of it. The hallways no longer felt welcoming but hollow, breathing in a way that buildings should not breathe. The pipes groaned, the lockers would pop open on their own, and the old wood of the structure shifted as if it were alive. When you're the only person inside, every sound cuts through the silence like a knife. The mind plays tricks, turning water in the pipes into footsteps, turning the slam of a vent into the echo of someone closing a door just out of sight. Of all the strange parts of the school, the basement was the worst. The place had been built in the 1950s and stretched beneath half of the building, a concrete labyrinth of narrow hallways, pipes overhead, and storage rooms crammed with whatever the school no longer wanted upstairs. Some rooms had desks piled to the ceiling, others contained broken chairs, dusty boxes of forgotten textbooks, and stacks of outdated furniture that hadn't been touched in decades. The smell down there was always the same: stale, damp, a mixture of mildew and rust.
Catch my breath.
The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, some flickering so violently that I had to bring a flashlight just to see where I was going. Even the older custodians warned me to avoid the basement unless I absolutely had to go. They laughed, called it haunted, but even in their laughter, there was a warning. For 2 years, I rarely set foot down there. I always found a way around it. But one night, I had no choice. My task sheet listed folding chairs, and the only set left in the building was stacked in the basement storage. I stood at the door to the stairwell for a full minute, staring at the heavy door, debating whether to call my supervisor and ask if it could wait until morning. I knew I'd look lazy if I did, so I grabbed my flashlight, pushed open the door, and started down. Each step I took echoed through the stairwell as if my boots weighed twice what they should. The switch at the bottom turned on only a few lights, leaving most of the hallway swallowed in shadows. The air hit me immediately damp, stale, carrying the sourness of wet concrete. I swallowed my nerves and walked toward the second storage room on the left, the one where the folding chairs were supposed to be. The first door was packed with desks. The second door squealed so loudly on its hinges that it made my teeth ache. Inside, the chairs leaned in uneven stacks against the wall. I bent down to grab as many as I could carry, desperate to make fewer trips. That was when I heard the soft drag of something across the floor outside the room. My body froze in place, my ears straining. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't furniture shifting. It was deliberate, slow, the unmistakable sound of someone sliding their shoe across the concrete hallway. I peeked out, my flashlight beam cutting across the corridor. Empty. Shadows stretched long across the walls, but nothing moved. My heart hammered in my chest, but I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I carried the first load of chairs to the stairwell, but halfway there, I felt Ida wave of freezing air against my face, sharp and cold like a freezer door had been opened. That basement had no windows, no airflow, nothing that could explain it. Still, I forced myself to drop the chairs by the stairs and go back for more. The second trip was worse. The stack of chairs looked different, as if someone had touched them while I was gone. I frowned, unable to remember exactly how they had leaned before. I convinced myself I was paranoid and picked up another load. That was when I heard a thump, followed by a long scraping sound farther down the hallway. My flashlight shook in my hand as I raised it, and my stomach sank. One of the classroom doors that should have been locked tight was cracked open, just wide enough for someone to peek through. I knew I hadn't touched that door. My throat went dry. Every instinct screamed at me to drop the chairs and run, but instead, like a fool, I stepped forward. I called out, my voice trembling, asking if anyone was there. Silence answered me. I forced myself to push the door open, shining the light inside. The room was empty, just stacks of old science equipment, boxes covered in dust, and cobwebs in every corner. I stepped inside, trying to prove to myself it was all in my head. Then I heard it again. The dragging shuffle. But this time, it came from behind me. I spun around, flashlight trembling, but the hallway was empty. Nothing but long corridors and shadows. Yet the pressure was there. That suffocating feeling you get when someone is staring at you from the dark. My skin prickled. I didn't care about the chairs anymore. I backed up slowly, my light fixed on the hallway, and when I reached the stairs, I grabbed the load I'd left and ran. I took the steps 2 at a time, bursting into the main hallway upstairs. My chest heaved, sweat rolling down my back even though the air was cold. I locked the stairwell door behind me, against the rules, but I didn't care. I told myself it was just pipes, just rats, just my nerves, but deep down I knew better. A week later, as I mopped above the basement, I heard it again, 3 loud bangs, evenly spaced, like fists pounding on the wall.
I am so sorry.
Then the door rattled violently as if something was trying to force its way out. I didn't open it. I stood frozen, clutching the mop handle, listening until the sound finally stopped. From that night on, I never went down into the basement alone. If something needed to be brought up, I waited for another custodian to be with me. I never told them what I heard or saw. They would have laughed, chalked it up to ghosts, but I know what I experienced. I know the sound of footsteps dragging in the dark, and I know the cold breath of something that wasn't supposed to be there. Even years later, the memory makes my stomach twist. That basement wasn't just a basement. It was something else, something alive, and it was watching. I spent 3 years working as a custodian at a large high school, and most of that time I was stuck with overnight shifts. It was the kind of job nobody wanted. The building itself was massive, stretching across 4 floors with 2 gyms, countless hallways, and wings that seemed to branch endlessly. During the day, it felt like a regular school, buzzing with energy, but at night it transformed into a maze of silence where shadows seemed heavier, and every sound echoed in unnatural ways. Normally we worked in pairs, but one Friday night I was alone. Another custodian had called in sick, leaving me with the entire building to cover by myself. I told myself it wouldn't be so bad. I had done most of the shift routines countless times before. I started on the first floor, moving through the classrooms, emptying trash, wiping surfaces, and locking doors behind me. The lights flickered in some of the older hallways, creating quick flashes that turned shadows into figures if you glanced too quickly. It was unnerving, but I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself the building was old and creaky. By midnight, I had reached the 3rd floor. That floor always gave me chills. Most of the classrooms there were outdated and rarely used. Some locked permanently, and others turned into storage. Boxes of old books, stacks of broken furniture, and forgotten lab equipment filled the rooms. The air felt heavier up there, as if the walls themselves held memories that refused to fade. As I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoed off the tile. The metallic clink of lockers expanding in the night air startled me more than once, making me jump like a nervous rookie. I was halfway through mopping the main hallway when something caught my eye. A classroom door stood slightly open about 20 feet away. That shouldn't have been possible. Earlier that evening, I had already checked the entire floor, making sure every door was locked tight. I froze with the mop in my hands, debating whether to ignore it and keep moving. But curiosity, or maybe duty, pushed me forward. I set the mop against the wall and walked slowly toward the door, each step feeling like it echoed far too loudly. The wooden door had a square glass window that reflected my flashlight back at me. I pushed it open cautiously, shining the beam into the dark classroom. At first, it seemed normal. Desks were stacked against the walls, boxes crowded into the corners. But then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One of the boxes at the far end of the room had been moved. It was tilted, sitting at an odd angle with scuff marks scratched into the tile as though it had been dragged across the floor recently. I knew I hadn't touched that box, and no one else should have been there. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a mistake, maybe I'd imagined it. Still, my skin crawled. I closed the door quickly and returned to my mop, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of cleaning. But the thought gnawed at me. Who had opened that door? Who had moved that box? I tried to convince myself the room had been like that all along. I forced myself to focus, finishing the hallway. Eventually, I turned back toward the stairwell to head down to the second floor. But as I passed the classroom again, my breath caught in my throat. The door was wide open now, gaping into the dark like a mouth. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had closed it. I was sure of it. I edged forward slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Inside, the room looked the same, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. The box had been moved again, this time sitting in the very center of the room. I whispered into the darkness, asking who was there, my voice small and shaking. Silence answered me at first. Then I heard a sound that no imagination could explain. Breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate breathing from the shadows at the back of the room. It was not the creak of a floorboard, not the sigh of pipes. It was someone drawing air in and out, steady and heavy, as though they wanted me to know they were there. Every hair on my body stood up. My knees felt weak. I convinced myself maybe it was a student playing a prank, hiding where they shouldn't be. But the school was locked. Every window sealed, every door secure. There should have been no one. Panic finally overtook me. I slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway, my boots striking the tile like gunshots. I burst into the stairwell, pressing my back to the cold wall, my chest heaving. I debated calling my supervisor, even though I hated the idea of waking him in the middle of the night. But the thought of going back upstairs alone was worse. I dialed his number, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. He told me to wait. He would be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes stretched into eternity. I stayed in the stairwell, flashlight pointed at the top of the stairs, expecting to see someone step into view. Every sound made me flinch. Finally, my supervisor arrived. Together we went back to the classroom. He walked in without hesitation, his larger flashlight sweeping the room. The box still sat in the middle of the floor. We checked under tables, behind desks, inside closets. Nothing. Empty. He told me I was tired, overworked, probably hearing things. I didn't argue, but I knew what I had heard. The slow breathing still echoed in my head. I tried to finish the rest of my shift with him nearby, but the building no longer felt like the same place. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound more sinister. I glanced back at that classroom every time we passed, expecting the door to open on its own again. Weeks later, another custodian told me a story. Years ago, a student had been caught hiding overnight in that very classroom, sneaking in as a prank. The incident had terrified the staff so badly that they stopped using the room altogether. The explanation made sense, but it did not explain the breathing I heard. There had been no one else there with me that night. Even months later, whenever I had to work that floor, I avoided it as long as I could. I moved quickly, refusing to linger near that room. The feeling of being watched never went away. Even in empty hallways, I felt eyes on me. Every creak of the floor, every slam of a locker made me jump. I told myself over and over it was just a building, just my nerves. But deep down, I knew I had stood in that room, and I had heard someone breathing in the dark, even though it should have been impossible. And that memory has never left me. For 2 years, I worked as a night custodian in an old high school. And though the job had its challenges, one part of the building always stood out as the worst: the auditorium. Even during the day, it was intimidating. A cavernous space with 3 levels of seating, a towering stage, and thick velvet curtains that seemed heavy enough to swallow light. At night, when the rest of the school was quiet and still, the auditorium transformed into something entirely different, a place where shadows lived and sound twisted unnaturally. The strange acoustics of the room made every noise disorienting. Drop a broom and the echo would scatter across the space, bouncing off the walls until you couldn't tell where it had started. Even with the overhead lights on, the corners seemed darker than they should be, like they held something the light couldn't touch. I hated working in there, so I always saved it for last. It was easier to power through when the end of my shift was close. But one winter night, the schedule forced me inside earlier than usual. There was going to be a school play the next morning, and the place needed to be spotless. It was close to midnight when I pushed open the creaking side door, dragging my cart behind me. The door slammed shut, and the sound carried through the auditorium like a gunshot. I tried to shake it off and started sweeping the aisles, the metal seats clanging faintly whenever my broom handle tapped them. Some rows had bolted chairs, others were loose, shifting just enough to scrape against the floor. I listened to the metallic scraping echo across the space, trying to keep my mind focused. After a few minutes, I froze. There was another sound, faint but distinct, like a soft rustle coming from the stage. My first thought was that a prop had fallen, but when I looked up, the stage was empty. I shook my head, forcing myself to keep working. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a rustle. It was the slow, deliberate rhythm of footsteps across the wooden stage. I gripped the broom tighter, my throat dry, and turned toward the stage. Nothing moved. The stacked scenery props and old chairs sat exactly where they should be. Still, the sound lingered in my mind. I climbed the steps cautiously, my flashlight beam sliding across the curtains, ropes, and pulleys. Dust floated through the light, dancing as if disturbed by something unseen. I felt eyes on me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I backed off the stage quickly, telling myself it was a trick of the acoustics, maybe a rat in the rafters, but my nerves were already frayed. I finished sweeping the lower level and started mopping, my back pressed closer to the wall than usual. As I pushed the mop through the rows, something flickered at the edge of my vision. A shadow, moving across the second tier of seats. I snapped my flashlight toward it, but the beam revealed only empty chairs. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue, each movement slower than the last. I was nearly done with the main floor when it happened again. A whisper drifted from above, faint and unintelligible. I froze mid-step, straining my ears. It wasn't the wind or the building settling. It was a voice. My name, whispered from the balcony. My hands trembled so badly the mop handle slipped, clattering against the tiles and echoing into the darkness. My chest tightened as I forced out a shaky call, asking if anyone was there. My voice sounded small, weak, swallowed by the room. No answer came. Only silence, followed by the echo of my own words. I told myself I had to finish the job. I moved toward the stage, dragging my mop and cart, forcing my legs to obey. Every step up the stairs felt longer than the last. My flashlight beam skimmed across the stage, and every time I thought I saw movement, it vanished before I could focus. Sometimes it was a flicker of shadow, sometimes the shape of a figure in the corner of my eye. I gritted my teeth, dusting props and sweeping the edges of the stage, anything to keep busy. Then I saw it. Looking out into the audience, my beam swept across the balcony, and for a split second, I caught the outline of someone sitting in the seats. Just a silhouette, still and dark. My heart slammed into my throat. I blinked, and the figure was gone. A chair, a trick of the light. That was what I told myself, but the dread clung to me like a weight. The whisper returned, clearer this time, and closer. A voice just behind me, speaking my name as if breathed into my ear. I spun around so fast the flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering onto the stage. The room was empty. The curtains didn't move. The props hadn't shifted. Yet the voice still echoed in my head. I backed away, step by step, the beam trembling in my shaking hands as I retrieved the flashlight. I made it to the stage's edge, listening. From above, footsteps echoed across the balcony, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth as if someone was watching me from above. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the side door, yanked it open, and nearly fell into the freezing night air. Relief flooded me, but even as I locked the door behind me, I could still hear faint footsteps echoing from within, fading into silence. The next morning, I told another custodian what had happened. He laughed, saying the building was old, the acoustics strange, and I was just spooking myself. But I knew what I had heard. Days later, I learned the truth. Years earlier, a drama teacher had died during rehearsal, collapsing from a sudden heart attack right there on stage in front of students. Some whispered that his spirit never left, pacing the auditorium at night, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was just a story, just coincidence, but deep down I couldn't believe it. The way that voice whispered my name, the deliberate footsteps pacing overhead, the shadow sitting in the balcony. Those weren't tricks of sound or light. They were real. I refused to clean the auditorium again. Before long, I quit the job entirely. Even after I left, when I thought back to that room, I felt the same pressure in my chest, the same cold weight of being watched. Whatever lingered in that auditorium didn't want to be ignored, and I will never forget the night it called my name. Long after the shifts ended, long after the doors were locked, and the classrooms emptied of students and staff, the memories of those nights stayed. What happened to me and the other custodians was not a single moment of fright, but something that grew and spread like a shadow, slipping into every part of our lives. We had entered these buildings thinking of them as just schools, nothing more than walls, floors, and classrooms. But in the quiet hours of the night, they became something else entirely. A labyrinth of cold spaces and unseen eyes, where ordinary tasks felt like walking into another world. Each of us began the job with the same mindset. It was work, a paycheck, a way to avoid the chaos of daytime crowds. The silence felt like a blessing at first. You could move from room to room without interruption, your thoughts, your only company. But the silence changed. It became dense, heavy, like water you had to push through.
I cannot believe
the
this.
creak of a pipe, the rattle of a vent, the hum of fluorescent lights, things you would never notice during the day took on new shapes at night. In that silence, every noise was a question. Every flicker of shadow was a warning. For me, it started in the basement. The smell of wet cement, the darkness beyond the flashlight's beam, the drag of footsteps that shouldn't have been there. It didn't end when I ran up the stairs. For weeks afterward, I would dream about the cracked door at the end of the hallway, the wave of cold air brushing my face. Even when I was mopping the main floor, far from the basement door, I could feel it beneath me, waiting. The sound of 3 loud bangs from below still echoes in my memory. I never went down there alone again, and even when others were with me, I felt the same pressure pressing against my back, the same warning not to stay too long. The custodian on the 3rd floor had his own story, but the fear felt familiar. The open door that should have been locked. The box moved without explanation. The sound of slow, deliberate breathing from the dark. He, too, tried to convince himself it was just a prank. A student hiding. The building settling. But deep down he knew, as I did, that something else was there. The fear didn't fade after the shift ended. It followed him up and down the stairwells, into his dreams, into every quiet hallway he had to cross. Even months later, he avoided that classroom, moving quickly past it like a man passing a graveyard at night. And then there was the auditorium. The custodian who worked there described the same feeling, only bigger, deeper. The footsteps pacing above him. The whisper of his own name called from the balcony. The shadow sitting in a seat one moment and gone the next. He told himself it was just acoustics, just tricks of light, until the story of the drama teacher's death reached him. Even then, knowing the legend didn't make it easier. He quit soon after. But like me, like all of us, the experience never left him. What made these nights so terrifying wasn't only the strange sounds or the flickering lights. It was the way the buildings themselves seemed to change after dark. Classrooms where children laughed became hollow shells, their walls cold and unwelcoming. Hallways turned into endless tunnels where footsteps echoed forever. Storage rooms became caves, filled with objects that seemed to shift when your back was turned. The schools were old, yes, but age alone couldn't explain the sense of being watched, the cold drafts in windowless basements, the voices that called our names. We stopped talking about it openly. Other staff would laugh, telling us we were imagining things, but we knew what we had felt. We adjusted our habits quietly. I refused to go into the basement alone. The 3rd floor custodian avoided that classroom whenever possible. The auditorium custodian wouldn't even open the side door after dark. None of us ever tried to prove anything. We didn't want to. Whatever we had felt, we didn't want it following us home. The fear had a way of creeping into life outside of work too. Walking alone at night in my own neighborhood, I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadow following me. At home, a creak in the floorboards would make my heart jump. Even surrounded by people, I sometimes felt the same cold draft from nowhere, the same pressure of unseen eyes. It was as if the buildings had marked me, leaving behind an imprint of their darkness. Looking back, I don't know what we encountered. Maybe it was ghosts, like the rumors said. Maybe it was just the mind unraveling under too much silence and too many dark hallways. But the fear was real. The breath I heard behind me in that basement was real. The voice whispering from the balcony was real. The sense of being watched wasn't my imagination. It pressed on my skin, it tightened my chest. It lingered long after the shift ended. The price of working in those places at night wasn't just fatigue or boredom. It was something deeper. The price was living with the knowledge that the world you thought you knew could change when the sun went down, that ordinary spaces could become places of dread. It was learning that silence can have weight, that shadows can feel alive, that sometimes you're not as alone as you think. Even now, years later, I find myself avoiding buildings after dark. I take extra precautions, lock doors twice, keep lights on in empty rooms. I tell myself it's just habit, but the truth is I remember. I remember the footsteps, the breathing, the whispers. They stay with me. They always will. When the lights go out and the doors are locked, a school should be nothing more than an empty building, a place that waits quietly for the morning bell. But the stories you just heard prove otherwise. For the janitors who lived them, these schools became something much darker, a basement that felt alive, echoing with footsteps that had no source, a classroom that opened on its own and breathed in the shadows, an auditorium where whispers carried names that no one should have known. These were not campfire tales. They were moments of genuine terror lived by ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. What unites these stories is not only the supernatural details, but the effect they had on those who experienced them. Each custodian carried the fear long after their shifts ended. They changed their routines, avoided certain places, and in some cases, left their jobs entirely. The buildings they once thought of as workplaces became haunted landscapes that refused to let them feel safe. That is the true horror, not just the sound of footsteps or the whisper of a voice, but the way fear embeds itself into memory and lingers like a scar. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, there are things you can do. Trust your instincts. Too often, we dismiss the chills on the back of our necks, the draft of cold air in a sealed room, the sound we know wasn't just the pipes. Pay attention. Fear is the body's way of warning us, and ignoring it can put us at risk. Second, never underestimate the power of company. Many of these stories turn terrifying because the custodians were alone. Having another person with you can make all the difference, both in safety and insanity. And finally, know when to walk away. No job, no task is worth staying in a place that feels wrong, a place that makes you feel truly unsafe. Perhaps these stories point to something supernatural, the lingering presence of lives cut short or emotions too strong to fade. Or perhaps they reveal the fragile line between the human mind and the darkness around it. Either way, the effect is real, fear is real, and when you're standing in an empty hallway, when the air turns cold and every instinct tells you that you are not alone, that reality becomes undeniable. We share these stories not just to scare, but to remind you that the world holds mysteries we cannot explain. What happened in those schools may never be fully understood, but they serve as a warning. Sometimes the places we trust most, the places we believe are safe, can hide the most chilling truths. If you want more stories like these, if you want to dive deeper into the shadows where real horror lives, then this is your place. Welcome to The Price Paid. Subscribe now, because there are many more truths waiting, and each one comes with a cost.